So the first part of that, I think, is that there is a comfort level that China has in terms of sort of blending economics and politics to an extent in the West, in the United States in particular, but to an extent in Europe. There's a separation of those two, or a belief that they should be separated. I think in China, in part just because of the socialist and Marxist background, there's a sort of comfort level or an almost assumption that economics conditions politics, and so they wouldn't necessarily see it as a surprise that those two go together. That said, I still think the BRI in most ways is still fundamentally commercial at the outset. I do think that China hopes to build political goodwill, but also to build political influence through deeper interdependence. The BRI is part of that. And so I think that's one difference, is just that comfort level that China has, just based on its different political and economic system. That's how things operate domestically, and I think they sort of assume that's how they operate internationally. Of course, Chinese government officials deny that there's any sort of geostrategic or political aims as part of the BRI, but I would say that it's basically assumed that there is a connection between economics and politics that runs pretty deep in China, and there's obviously a different view in the West, in the US and Europe in particular. The term debt trap diplomacy really started in around 2017 or so. So it's a relatively new term, and I would say it's a very politicized term that largely comes from the US official foreign policy pushback against China that began in the US. You'll see some Indian scholars and pundits that sort of use that same framework. You can sort of locate the beginning of the use of that term in US diplomacy, and then also coming from some Indian analysts. And it's basically a claim that China purposely is doing some of its loans for infrastructure deals in a way that is meant to trap other countries by basically lending them money for projects which China knows that those countries can't repay. I've written about in the case of Venezuela and Sri Lanka, where I think if you look a little bit more closely, what you see is cases where there are deep problems with the loans, with the projects themselves, but it wasn't intentional, that the idea was to lend with the idea that the other country or the other businesses would be unable to repay, and then China would be able to take over. There were political motivations on both sides. Host countries, for example, in the case of Sri Lanka, but also in the case of Venezuela, they came up with projects or structures for the loans that really were not all that well thought through in the first place. So I basically think the idea of debt trap diplomacy is not very helpful. It really doesn't explain largely what's happened. That said, there are big problems with a number of these projects. Depends on where you look. You have to look at the specific projects and see whether or not they make good sense originally or not. A lot of them are proposed by the host governments for various reasons, or not even host governments. Businesses come up with ideas for projects that may or may not be well thought through. I think it has that potential. I mean, if you look at any kind of foreign government building infrastructure, whether that's transport infrastructure or energy infrastructure or now digital infrastructure, any foreign country doing that in any other country, I think has for the last few centuries had the potential to be seen as a security risk. I think you can see some of these concerns that developed like in the 19th century with British or European or American financing or building of infrastructure in South America, for example. You see instances of this in Africa as well. There's always this potential, and different governments at different points in history have been more or less comfortable with allowing for foreign governments to come in and do some of that financing and building of foreign infrastructure. But I think in general, even historically, it's been the case that this is the risk factors involved really come back to the rules and how well enforced they are of the host countries. So again, going back to the debt trap diplomacy kind of idea, I think even if it were China's intent, which I really don't think it is to sort of trap other countries and then take over these infrastructure projects, I think they would have a lot of limits on their ability to actually do that. So for example, in the case of the Sri Lankan port, let's say that China wanted to come in and use that for military purposes or something. That would involve it wouldn't be very easily done on China's part. The Sri Lankan government would almost certainly oppose that. There are many different ways in which it might go about opposing that. So there's no easy way in which China could actually sort of physically, I think, claim full control over some of these projects in other countries. So there are ways in which I think China's financing and building of infrastructure in other countries does bring up real questions of sovereignty. I do think there are limits on what China could actually do in reality in terms of sort of taking physical control or even financial control over these things. Where I see real potential for this, though, is in China's promotion of special economic zones. And I don't know if you saw this in the case of in Kazakhstan or elsewhere in Central Asia, but China's been promoting these overseas special economic zones in other countries. We see a lot of it in Africa, but increasingly also in Southeast Asia, including in areas where China shares a border with other countries. So it's proposed some of these deals, for instance, with Vietnam and other countries in the region. And then what you see is a sort of potential breakdown of the border area or of sovereignty, or of where you could see the potential for China trying to carve out areas where the host country laws and rules and standards really have to sort of make way for these special economic zones, which are going to have sort of special legal treatment, which is more or less in line with China's interests. I don't think that China could impose this unilaterally, but I see this as an area where there's big question marks about sovereignty. From what I understand, countries like Vietnam have been very reluctant to agree to anything like this, exactly because of concerns about sovereignty. It really comes back to the question again of how able those host governments are to structure the deals in ways that they want. Sometimes it makes some sense. If a country has a lot of bureaucracy, then maybe it makes sense to carve out an area where where there's less red tape, fewer challenges or difficulties in just doing business and creating industrial parks and manufacturing for export zones. That's certainly what happened in China to a certain extent, but it really does bring up questions of sovereignty. And I think any country that's going to enter into an agreement like that with China or anyone else needs to really think clearly what it means to create these sort of exceptional zones when it comes to local rules. The problem is in lots of different places, projects are not well thought through. There's a reason why it's difficult to build good quality infrastructure in various different countries, especially in developing or poor countries. There are political reasons, historical reasons why it's difficult to build good infrastructure. There are lots of reasons in any given country why it's difficult to build more and better infrastructure. And China, just by coming in and throwing money at it, can't necessarily solve that and may make the situation worse. It all comes back to project selection, to why is a highway project or a port project or an energy project, why is that the best project or not. And I think this is, for me at least, this is where a lot of the challenge comes in who gets to decide what's a good project and why. Do local communities get to be involved or not? Who's deciding on the environmental impact assessment and whether that's acceptable or not? For instance, if you're building a dam project, China's doing a lot of financing and building of coal-fired power plants in other countries. A lot of that comes from local demand. It's not China putting a gun to anyone's head and saying you must build this coal-fired power plant. It comes from local demand, but a lot of that local demand also means businesses or government officials who are willing to go against national environmental or climate plans. And so the Chinese side tends to be fairly flexible in doing those kinds of deals. The end result is you get a bunch of coal-fired power plants built, which are then polluting, less efficient, and potentially not economically viable in the long run either. So it really comes down to the specific projects, why they're chosen, who gets to decide. A lot of times it's politicized. There's not enough engagement with local communities. There's not enough careful risk analysis done at many different levels. And that happens both on the host country and the Chinese side. That said, I still think part of the reason for the popularity of the BRI in a lot of regions is because there's this fundamental recognition that, yes, more better infrastructure really could be helpful to overcome long-standing challenges. And even with all these downsides, I think a lot of countries are willing to give it a try. I'm pretty skeptical about this. I think most of the projects, especially the really big ones that you see, port projects, highway projects, even like energy transportation projects, or railway projects, those who are involved in these really major projects that are worth hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, those tend to be things that are negotiated between governments. Often, at least on the Chinese side, they are supported by state-owned companies or state-owned banks. Host governments almost always have some sort of major government control in that. I've heard complaints in quite a few countries that are from smaller, medium-sized businesses who are happy to see more infrastructure ideas out there, including cooperation with China, but they feel excluded from being able to participate, and they think that, well, this just builds on or supports old patterns where the people who already have the money and the power get to have more of it. I think there's always those concerns. There's question marks about how much you can actually democratize big projects like this. So there's a point at which when you have too much involvement, it just can't really be done. That said, I think there has been far too little community involvement, again, on sort of the social impact, the environmental impact. If a project involves, for instance, building energy infrastructure, whether that's a dam or a power plant of some kind, not only do you have the environmental impact of sort of, do you build a dam and then does that dislocate people and what happens to the water flow and use of the river and all of that. But also, where does the energy that's created go? So in some neighboring countries, there are big concerns about that. So in Myanmar, if you build a dam that is going to dislocate people, is going to create all kinds of environmental impact, and then 90% of the energy goes back to Yunnan province in China, that doesn't make people happy. So there is, I think, a lot of potential for these projects to basically be in the interests of government officials or powerful businesses or powerful groups, including militaries in some countries, or families of powerful officials in some countries. And that's a concern. China has a pretty high level of comfort with doing things like that because I think a lot of Chinese officials, government officials, and businesses feel that builds in security. They know who they're dealing with. They like government-to-government deal making. They think that if you do it that way, then you can kind of count on the other side to hold up to its end of the bargain. And I think in some cases that's true. China's run into problems with that in some places, and I'd say Myanmar is one of those cases. Or if you just have really complex governance in some places. Again, Myanmar, parts of that country just are not controlled by the central government. So it really depends on where you're looking, but that's certainly China's comfort zone, is to do things in a way that's government to government, and doesn't necessarily engage with local communities in the way that I think would be more sustainable. That's certainly China's model domestically. There wasn't a whole lot of community engagement. China was going to build a big dam or a highway or a railway or an airport. It could basically tell the people in those areas that it was going to do it, and it would move them. And if people said they didn't want to move, they would get moved anyway. So that's a little bit trickier when you do it in other countries, but again, it's, I think, not necessarily in the sort of normal mode of operating that Chinese officials, government officials, businesses would sort of choose to do that level of consultation or to follow sort of corporate social responsibility rules and regulations. There's a lot of change in this. I think it's improving, but it all depends on kind of host governments and host communities and whether or not they're willing and able to sort of demand different kinds of procedures with the Chinese counterparts.